Shall we begin?
Okay. Click to hit record. Welcome, everyone. September, so always exciting. I don't know if anyone has any announcements or highlights since the last meeting. Sounds like not. Cool. Next section is to try and have time and space for anyone who might have questions or PRs or anyone from the community who's got an issue they want to raise. Kind of anything. It's an open moment.
So it was relayed to me that we wanted to add things to the milestone. So I added the PR that we're most interested in to the milestone, but I don't want to get ahead of it. That's also what I wanted to discuss if anyone else doesn't have anything. Nobody else has any PRs to discuss?
Sounds like, I mean, there's a handful of agenda items, but if, no community people are stepping forward, you can jump in.
Yeah, I think we're going to have some, we're going to have some discussion about like the ongoing PRs that have been like open, week after week after week after week later on. But yeah, anything sort of new or someone's considering a PR. Also, why we're here in the beginning of the meeting? Anything fun happen in people's lives? I feel like, we've got to keep it lighthearted a little bit.
School might be starting if you go somewhere that still has school.
Learning is good.
Not sure how many of you have school-aged children, though, so, But I don't know. My world is school and work and a little bit of osquery on the side. So, child and work, excuse me.
That's the best recipe. Hopefully osquery is your dessert.
Yeah, let's go with that theory. I think if we want to talk about the SIG URL to Yara signatures, it seems fine. It's pull 6607. Although, I don't know, it's also stuff we could talk about in the PR, so like whatever.
Yeah, it was just, I thought maybe we could, so there was, all of us here were on the PR comments. We were discussing, I guess the last thing to discuss was whether a URL that points to signatures should be supplied in the config file, or if it could be supplied in the query, or if we want to leave it to the user, or if one of them should be optional or hidden. I think the way it's implemented now, it's a URL or set of URLs that are permitted, and they're in the config file only. Seth had a comment that it was unnecessarily indirect to do it that way. Should it also be possible via a query? I guess that's what I would say.
I think my perspective is around like what's cumbersome and what problem are you solving. So if you exist in an environment where you have different people who can set osquery configuration, then can run live queries, and you want to restrict sort of the places they can pull Yara from, then there's an argument, I think, to having something in the config file. But if you exist in a place where those are basically the same privilege domain, then you're sort of just adding extra steps and needless indirection, right? I'm thinking about like, what are the steps I have to take to add a new Yara signature, right? Like maybe I put it in my security distributed URL set, or like, I don't, whatever. And then I have to update every client and restart osquery? That sounds terrible. Can I just live query this? Like who, like, what are we protecting from and how are these privileged domains different? And then once I said all of that, I was like, oh, maybe you could just have a whitelist or an allow list in the config file and be like, you want to allow URLs to be passed in, then here's a regex-based allow list and call it a day.
I guess it is a question for people with osquery deployments. but I would expect the privilege levels to be the same, except I know that some organizations might have configuration managed by admin, and then queries which are sort of produced by like a threat hunting team that maybe has an API to I'm thinking like the upticks people. And I know that they're not probably going to have this version of osquery for a long time, but it's one model that is used.
When you see that model, though, it's almost the invert, though, because you want the threat hunting people to be able to push new Yara URLs in without having to go bother the IT endpoint management folk.
Possibly, or maybe the URL will be rarely changed and it'll be updated at the cloud, wherever that URL is pointed to.
Having a single URL feels weird.
Well, multiple. It's a set of URLs that you would be.
How do you introduce a new query? A new Yara signature? How do you version Yara signatures? How do you distribute them? It's like all the standard software distribution questions.
It's outsourcing those questions to whoever maintains the Yara list, the signature list at a resource. That's kind of the use case that started this whole thing.
I think my gut sense, I think I'm leaning strongly, sorry, I'll say this all in a different way. I think creating a named URL indirection layer adds a lot of weird overhead and opportunities for people to make mistakes in implementation. So I would strongly favor a stick the URL in the query and create an allow list configuration parameter. You could even kind of default to having like, by default, you know, the allow list is empty, so you get nothing. And then you can kind of skip needing a command line flag to enable the feature. You either define allow URLs or you don't. I'd probably recommend some basic globbing support there, so you can do something like, say, allow all from my, from my GitHub prefix or something, right? So it lets you easily be like, allow everything released under this corner of the world. I think you also get better results back because you start being able to say, if you look at your results set and it becomes self-contained for what URL it was matched against, as opposed to sort of having a weird shim layer of like, oh, we got hits on URL 1, and then you say, well, what was URL 1? And you have to go back and check your config files for that point in time.
I'm just trying to catch up here. Was the point of all this indirection because of the potential file exfiltration issue with Yara?
No, I'm not wholly sure why the indirection exists, so I'm trying to minimize it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, I had this indirection just to avoid someone potentially misusing it in terms of passing any URL and downloading the data into the memory. Yeah, so that was the main purpose to have this indirection. Now, if having an allowed list, I think that is also a good idea. We can discuss about that. Like if anyone is passing in, because one of the restriction I see with the current approach is, like you are just registering one URL. Now, if someone wants to change the Yara rule, then probably either he has to update the file or possibly register another URL with the configuration. So that limitation is there. Now, having allowed list, certainly we can get rid of that restriction. We can pass some allowed list based on maybe from some GitHub, it can get whatever the Yara rules passed using the query, and it can get that.
The other sort of direction here is that to some degree, this is a syntactic sugar over joining curl against the existing content-based Yara rule queries.
It wasn't possible to point to a URL before. You had to supply the signatures on disk. So
right,
it's
so
not
we merged
really a
that.
join. No, we merged being able to provide them in a query.
Right, so can't you just join against curl now?
With thousands of signatures or Yara rules in a query, yes, but it didn't scale to the usage. The usage goal here was to, again, not have queries, be managed by the osquery users. The users or the admins or however osquery is being queried, goal is that they should know they have a trusted source of Yara rules and they want to use it as the basis for their query without having to be the maintainers of that resource. That's the real goal of the indirection. Whether it's protected at one level of access or another is that's PR feedback. We want to make it work for whatever is sensible, but the only goal here is that you be able to let Yara rule management be someone else's problem. So do we have actionable changes requested?
In the PR?
I made some.
Yeah, like
Okay.
Seth
let's just
comment on that.
Okay. Well, let's just codify that or document it, and we can work towards that resolution. But I really wanted to see this in 4.5. Okay, CSF's typing. Okay, so to what it adds over joining curl's table results. I guess I don't understand how you would use curl to return the Yara rules individually. You would get a file back, wouldn't you?
You get the contents back.
Can you join it line by line using the...
I mean, while I think it may be possible to do it with curl, I don't think that the possibility of that would be the reason not to have such other options.
So it hasn't been tested that way. I mean, let's just say you have a sig rule file with 1,000 rules. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but let's say a lot of rules, and it returns line by line, joins into another table that does a Yara scan. It will do one Yara scan per rule.
I don't think that's correct.
All of the rules.
No, I think you would get back one big body of content. It would be the same as if you squirted that 1,000-line thing directly into a live query, which probably runs into the query length limitations. So, okay. But I think Zach's also right, is that even if it's theoretically possible, that doesn't mean this is unreasonable syntactic sugar.
Yeah, I feel like it's a user... I mean, the whole thing is for the user's workflow and enabling them to abstract away.
Let's table that for a moment, because I want to actually revisit this part of this conversation, a couple line items down on the agenda. But I'll accept that even if duplicative with curl, that's not really a blocker. So I'll withdraw that. That's not a real objection, let's say.
Question still about this. Would it be better, Seth, if we were to use the same configuration key rather than using a new one? I'm not sure if we are using the same config setup as the existing one for Yara. I remember
I have no idea. I have no idea what the existing config setup is. Mostly, I think the extra layer of naming URLs and then having to select by them is cumbersome and non-desirable, just from like dealing with similar things in past contexts. It doesn't feel like the right UI experience. I think just having sort of an allow list there and then checking the URLs against it is smoother.
Yeah, so I was looking at the existing configuration options for Yara and was wondering if it did make sense to use the same signatures object, but detect the protocol. So if we have file or HTTPS, we switch to the right implementation. So because I guess that the problem here was to attempt to minimize how many times these signatures are in flight.
Does the existing configuration? I sort of have the impression that if you hit the Yara thing, you'll basically get every signature against every file path.
It seems like you can select which group you use, but I'm not sure. I'm not that familiar with. Maybe Stefano has taken a look at it.
But, you know,
yeah, you can.
Sorry, go on.
No, just saying. Yeah, you can create groups with signature files in it, and then use the query. You pass the sig group you want to use.
So in theory, we could get away with just adding support for a different protocol, right? It was a question for Stefano.
Yeah, I mean, I thought so. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if I understood it right. What's Seth's concern specifically on this? I thought that it was just the method in general, but what this should change?
Well, we wouldn't have to add a different variant of configuration types, so it would still work.
Well, I mean, that's important.
It doesn't really alleviate my concern, right? My concern is, right, okay, so I now have a new signature rule that I need to add. What are the steps I have to take to do that? I have to update the config on every endpoint to create a new named indirection layer. And when I actually get the results back, I get the results back not telling me what URL they match, but telling me what the named indirection is. And that all feels very backwards to how I would expect to use something. I would expect to sort of say, you know, select star from these matching files where they match this URL, right? And I would just expect the URL to go through an allow list at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I can only that if you use a group, what you get back from the query, from the sig group column, is only the group. You won't know which rules inside it have been used. So you have to know what that group means.
I think probably discussion should continue in PR.
Okay, we can move on.
Next item, release 4.5.0, milestone 50. So I know on Slack I mentioned I didn't think we could cut a release soon, but I guess we did say we were targeting about September 1, and we have merged a bunch of PRs, so I don't know. People want to cut a release soon?
I think there's some pretty good fixes in master right now, and I'm an advocate for cutting a release as it exists right now.
You think we should try and get the ARM64 or Windows 32 merged?
I think those are on track to be merged. I don't want to wait for them, nor do I want to rush them.
So let's see. Do we have anything else exciting in flight that people want to advocate we hold for? I know Mike's going to say the SIG URL and Yara signatures, but
yeah, the Yara stuff.
I think the biggest change that's influencing my call to action to do 450 right now is the RocksDB small SST sort of merger. There are two things here that are really important. One, this like thousands of SST files that people have recognized has been a problem for years. Never really found a solution for it. So really excited about that. I don't think that causes practical problems. It's mostly aesthetic. The practical problem years ago was that RocksDB would try to open all of them and run out of file descriptors, but we fixed that. The second thing with this change is a practical problem, in that RocksDB databases can grow very large. They shouldn't fill up your entire disk. They do have a limit, but we're talking about like 250 gigs. So the new change will keep the size of the database relatively low. For example, we shouldn't expect the database to go over about 1 or 2 gigs. The reason it grows is because by default, RocksDB just places a tombstone concept in the deleted key field. And then it waits for compaction to occur before it removes the tombstone. There are a lot of technical details of why this is the best approach. It is the best approach. Our change forces compaction to happen every time osquery starts, and then every hour after that. There are cases where compaction may never occur because we never hit limits of the sizes of our total SST or the total layer in our layer compaction. So merging a chain or releasing right now, if people are able to deploy the new release, would do 2 really cool things. One, it would reduce their SSTs to about less than 10 if they have thousands right now. And it could potentially free up hundreds of gigs on their disks. So pretty good wins. I think that's enough for a release.
It's a pretty compelling set of reasons. I am willing to hang out and try and hammer through 6607 with Mike and Kumar and anyone else who wants to talk about that after maybe people get bored and leave. Because I'm happy to sort of try and like chill a couple of days so you can get that in. But I think Teddy's got a pretty reasonable argument, and maybe we don't want to wait a few weeks.
Yeah, we'll stay on top of the PR that we're talking about and that it's moving so that we can justify that couple of days. But that's it. Yeah.
Anyone? Teddy?
I would put a counter to my advocacy here. It's just like, this has been a bug that's been around for years. If we wait a few weeks, it doesn't really matter. But
why wait, though?
Why wait? Yeah.
You've got a good argument. We'll have another release in 2 months. Don't have to onks too much.
Yep.
So the other 2 items that I stuck down here were ARM64 and Windows 32-bit, because I'm sure everyone wants to talk about them or something. Maybe.
Yeah, I'll kick off a discussion here. So the Windows 32-bit, I think, is mergeable right now. If you look into, so this essentially does 2 things. One, it adds testing for Windows 32-bit, which is cool, and then it changes a lot of implicit type conversions. What it doesn't do is change all of the implicit type conversions. So if you look at the test and sort of grep through grep for loss of data, you'll see, I think, on the order of like 30 or more instances where we need to do more work here. The actual work would be just fixing those type conversions. Two options, like we can merge it as is. It's not really going to affect anything. We're not providing a 32-bit release for Windows. As of right now, we're not really officially supporting a release for 32-bit Windows. So it doesn't really negatively affect us. It opens up a window for more people to help out with the type conversions. I think it's unlikely that will really happen. I'm being practical. So we can wait and not merge that until all the types have been converted. That is a bit of a moving target, but it's one that's achievable. What other folks think? Did I miss anything here?
Do we have a mechanism to eventually enforce the no implicit type conversions?
I think your suggestion is a good one. It seems like a lot of work to add W conversion and then eventually promote that to an error. I'm willing to do that work, essentially go through the like hundreds of conversions that we have right now within our code, not within third-party code, but within our code to fix all of those.
My suggestion was roughly grep the output.
Yeah. What I hope is the situation is like we could turn on that flag for our code and not third-party code, and we could address all the instances where we are doing an implicit type conversion.
My gut, I think it is better to merge as is, because I think these long-running big things that have moving targets are very hard to carry forward each time. So if you and Stefano are happy with the underlying code quality, I know both of you have commented, then I would say we should merge as is and sort of continue playing the game of like whack-a-mole on the implicit type conversions.
Yeah, I look at the PR selfishly from the like, what does this provide the 64-bit version? And I think it's just a lot of code quality improvements.
Yeah, it sounded like we were generally happy with what this did, even if we don't particularly have a lot of 32-bit deployments. So code quality always good.
Are we going to include this into the CI?
I think that's in the PR already.
Or rather, can we even do it? I mean, there's a 32-bit worker for Azure.
I believe it's using the 64-bit workers, but the 32-bit user space or the 32-bit libraries. Nice. So it's like not quite as perfect, but like, good enough.
Actually, Breakwell updated the PR an hour ago, so I think we're good to go here. Yeah, it's already added another build target for 32-bit.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm good merging, even knowing that there's still a little bit of a moving target. It's the same theory we have for the 64-bit, so. Sounds like, I don't know, maybe Teddy or Stefano or something will take another once over and then click merge or something. I'll comment on this after the meeting. Anyone want to give a quick update on ARM64?
There's another contributor, Benjamin, who is helping out with this effort. I believe we have decided to merge this as soon as possible. which I'm really happy about. There are a couple of things to fix, really nitpicks, and I think it is mostly ready. The study has some things to add, and actually one thing left is to update the commits so that we include the original contributor for the pull request. And also, I already have A1 metal instance I can use, and we can use it to generate packages if we want, test packages.
So is the ARM64 one fully baked, or do we think there's sort of going to be a little bit of a bunch of random follow-up items once this is merged?
The biggest issues we had initially were about the libraries and a couple of the tables which were being updated to do a no-op, like a CPU ID. The newest commits, however, seem to fix the table issues, so they should be up to date. We may have to do some additional work on the libraries in the future, but otherwise it should be pretty good.
Cool. My impression from Slack is that y'all were going to merge it as soon as the commit attribution was sorted out.
Yeah, study wants to add more.
There's some requested changes too, so
yeah.
I did want to add one thing. So like a heads up, what impact does this have on the project? I think it adds more complexity to introducing new libraries and to updating libraries, which is already very complex. So to update a library, it's kind of ambiguous. Each one of the libraries has a little bit of different build that you would have to follow, produces a little bit of different artifacts, and then you have to sort of know which ones to bring over into osquery's build logic. And there's a lot of institutional knowledge there that can be captured in like a README file in each one of the libraries. But with ARM64, we would now have to do that once for the 64-bit x86 build, and now we're going to have to do that again for the ARM build. I think this very much limits the number of people who can update a library to someone that has access to these systems, as well as understands how to build these libraries and what to bring over to osquery. I don't have a good solution for this right now. I just wanted to mention that.
One solution could be so right now we are always importing all the libraries from the main CMake list file. It was recommended to move the find packages where the library is actually used. So we could move like the Amazon S3 libraries inside the logger where we use it. So it is easier to disable components that we do not want to build right now for a specific architecture.
Is that something that you envision would help in testing, or something that you think would help for developing for a platform? And by testing, I mean, like if I'm developing a feature, like do you imagine that I would disable building the AWS table for my local builds?
Well, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. We do know there are users that would like to disable tables rather than like logger plugins. But we could implement this in a way that works for both.
I mean, without getting, I don't know. I think we've made ourselves a very hard problem with the way our dependencies work. And I'm not sure there's an easier answer, right? Because we're trying to basically capture and build our dependencies. So we're sort of shipping an entire little ecosystem. And it feels like the right answer, but it's a hard problem. And I feel like the only way to simplify that a bit is to figure out how to push more and more of those into some CI that maintains the artifacts, right? So you don't do it at build time. Build time generally just fetches from whatever our artifact stores are. And then, the act of adding a dependency kind of has this other flow of like, I'm PRing something into our dependency library, and then we check the build for that, right? It becomes like a bit more of a two-step.
Yeah, so the biggest trouble with that is that right now when you import a library, it's not just a single library, but a tree of transitive dependencies, properties, and so on. It's hard to easily export all this data in a folder that can be later fetched back, providing again the same tree of properties and dependencies.
Yeah. I don't feel like we need to solve this now. It feels like a hard problem to keep thinking about.
Yeah.
It's also, it's not even core OS query. It's like this distraction that we have to get right to do the thing we want to do.
But I think that if we can really move define packages calls, things will improve dramatically if we then are able to disable things. Because we can decide that, well, let's say there's this library that is really hard to port to AR64. We can just disable the components that use it.
I mean, maybe. It depends what the component is.
Yeah, sure.
That's too hypothetical,
ideally,
right?
But ideally, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I mean, we did have some kind of component selection in the old build system to disable tables. I don't remember if we could also disable other things as well. But yeah.
So I think there's one kind of meta thing here is how do we attract and retain talent that can do this sort of build and wants to continue to improve it. So Artemis, for example, did maybe 90+% of the heavy lifting here. Are they still part of the project, or is this sort of like a one-off change proposed to solve a specific goal? Now they're gone. That's sort of what I would like an answer for. So maybe we can poll the general chat, like who is actually willing to support the ARM64 build and has experience with building all these dependencies that can help us out in the future. This is one thing. The second thing is this concretely affects, I think, 3 pull requests that are up right now. One, the extended attributes pull request that adds a library. 2, the systemd and expat integration. Those are a library, so we would need the AR64 version. And 3, the BPF build. So and we're going to see that pattern repeated every time we introduce a new library. That person's going to have to go and build the x86 and the ARM64 version. I don't think the TikTok of like add it for one and then later we'll add it for another is a really good solution. Because if you look at that under the lens of how do you upgrade a library, does that mean that we like take out support for a architecture every time we want to upgrade and then wait until someone else comes along and upgrades that architecture and then bring it back into testing? I think we need to do both of the builds every time we introduce a new library or upgrade a library.
Yeah. To me, this just, I guess, harkens back to the thing I said of the only way I know to make that better is to really divorce them so that you have, one thing where you build all the libraries into an artifact store. Kind of like smells a little bit like homebrew at some level.
Yeah, but I mean, you mean removing the CMake stuff we have written to support the libraries?
I don't know if it means removing it or just defining a different kind of layer. I don't know. Like the CMake stuff you have is pretty far over my head.
Yeah, because I mean, if we I believe that the only way to solve this is, without too much work, is to go back to the Linux Brew system to manage the dependencies. Because otherwise, whether this stuff is inside the same repo or outside, or whether we use source or pre-built artifacts, there is still someone that has to convert the libraries.
I think some of where I'm going, though, is if converting a library becomes a smaller, well-defined step that has a CI build cycle, then we're lowering the bar. It's still a process that you have to do, but it's a process that has less work, right? Like I could imagine, if I think about Homebrew, right, I can kind of upgrade a library by basically PRing a version number change into some metadata field somewhere. And, then their build systems will either like succeed or fail. So I sort of imagine something similar, right? Of like, can we define a set of metadata? And I feel like we're like halfway there already between the submodules and all these other things. Can I just PR a change there, PR a change to the config, the configuration, the autoconf options, and like, will it magically work? Or like, where do I go from there? So I don't know. I don't understand enough of the CMake stuff. I'm sorry.
So in theory, we do already have, we already get back an error if we do something bad in dependencies. And yeah, of course, maybe we don't catch it at compile time if there's something really broken in dependencies, but I don't think it would change much if we had the stuff outside the repo.
Outside the repo is almost sort of, I don't know, there's an interesting other thing here to me of like, if I PR a simple change to a library, why am I waiting like 2 hours for the osquery, CI cycle to complete? Maybe I have to, but I feel like there's this, something is missing to me. Like everything feels monolithic in a way that doesn't feel like it needs to be.
Yeah, mostly because we propagate settings and flags.
Is this the most important thing we could talk about, Teddy?
We've been talking about this for 5 years, so.
So, I mean, the problem is that it is easy to break osquery if we change a library, because maybe we end up changing interfaces, or maybe we do not correctly propagate the osquery flags, compilation flags and settings backward to all the libraries. So that will make it easier to have artifacts that are no longer compatible with osquery.
I still I feel like there's space to separate them, where I have one thing where I build artifacts into a versioned repository. osquery doesn't use the head of that. It uses whatever we've checked in as like there's a two thing. Like one thing is I define the build process for an artifact, and it's versioned with whatever the get version is on that definition, right? And then osquery points to that. So it becomes kind of a two-step thing. I don't know. Maybe it's not a win. Maybe it is. Maybe we've already done it in 4 years ago before my time.
Yeah. So that's true. But however, that will mean that any intermediate steps and commits inside the repository for the dependencies are not to be taken with, have to be taken with a grain of salt, because
that's true.
They may pass the CI, but they may not be compatible.
It's sort of like your standard monorepo argument, I guess, of like putting these in, yeah. I don't know. Bummer.
I think going back to like, should we merge the AR64? I think we can do it now. We can merge the code. Again, it's like we don't sign ourselves up for anything. We can easily remove it. We don't commit to publishing packages here or really supporting it. It's sort of like a community supported feature. If we observe that it keeps lagging behind and that like no one's committing to keeping the dependencies on par with x86 dependencies, then that's evidence that we should remove it. And really what we need here is documentation, is like a guide on how to introduce a new dependency with a little bit of tooling on how to start like 2 VMs that have sort of the right base image and high-level steps to like configuring and building the dependency, and what usually is moved over into the CMake source directory. I think with that tutorial and with that guidance, we would be able to like more easily support new dependencies being added for both of the architectures.
I mean, as a side note here, right, is I suspect we're really going to want this to support Apple Silicon. I think it's probably a step on the way to Apple Silicon. I think we also already have a bug open or an issue filed for some documentation on adding new libraries.
Yeah.
So if we're done with that topic, I have a question for the crowd, or comment for the crowd. I don't know, something like that. In reviewing some PRs, I noticed we have some PRs that feel a bit like formatting around the registry, sort of like pull some registry data, format it correctly, and then spit it back to people. Do we want that? I'm really ambivalent because we have a registry table, so I'm sort of against a lot of tables that mostly do the same thing in little ways, but maybe other people want it. So I don't know. They feel hard to maintain to me.
I'm sorry, which table was it you were referring to?
I was trying not to name the submitter because it felt rude. But these were some tables for Office most recently used files and background activity monitor.
I'm personally not opposed to such things, especially if they're doing any kind of parsing with the data that comes out of the registry, because that is not necessarily possible with the default stuff. And even so, I think that registry is a pretty low level tool, and having some abstractions is totally fine with me.
The thing that I've seen sort of happen, both in the stuff Collide maintains and in the osquery ones, is anytime we hardcode paths, the paths get out of date sometimes. So there's this weird issue of like, Office will update a path somewhere, and, we won't necessarily notice for a while, then we'll notice, but like, then it's still going to be broken until we cut a new release. So what that has meant for us is that we frequently end up moving away from these convenience tables and just using the underlying raw tables directly, which means we're no longer catching errors in them. So it feels like when we add syntactic sugar, we really have to make sure to stay on top of it and think about what it's adding. And for a lot of what we do at Collide, we've basically completely gotten away from that. It's just, we found it too hard to maintain and ship updates to client code. It's much easier to just have some very raw level access and sort of handle it all server side.
So maybe we can make a guideline around what would be acceptable and not, as far as things that come to the registry. Like, I haven't seen these PRs that you're referring to, but there's a pretty limited amount of parsing that you can do of data in the SQL. So if those are doing any kind of parsing, then I think then you can't replace that data by just, you can't replace that functionality with just raw SQL. But I hear what you're saying about the changes in the underlying system and trying to keep up with those. So maybe those sorts of things can be put into guidelines and communicated to folks in some way.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to like get a sense of where other people are.
As an analog, I think most of the macOS tables are querying a plist file at some level, right?
No, about half of them are APIs. Some of them are hitting plist files.
Okay. Well, there's definitely a precedent for multiple tables doing plist access. And we would not ask everyone to memorize where the plists are.
So there's some precedent, but like we've also run into issues where several of the osquery tables are broken. And I don't have that list off the top of my head. And they get broken in weird ways. And some of this is like fundamentally when we query plist files versus an API, we run into these weird issues where we don't osquery does not correctly interpret things like MDM utilization or non-MDM based profiles. So like Collide has ended up moving away from a lot of those because they don't correctly roll up all of those levels of overlays that are implicit in Apple itself. Also,
this is kind of like, I think, osquery's job is to abstract this content for people. And so I think if these tables get outdated or like we discover limitations, like we should seek to fix them. But common concepts we should abstract, right? And so I think this is going through the registry and taking like common, let's say, forensics artifacts and making them available as a table with some syntactic sugar is a huge value add that osquery provides.
Yeah, and one thing that I realized going along with that is that if these paths and these kind of things are changing, if the stuff's built into a table, then one person has to go and put up a PR to fix it, and then everyone benefits from that in the next release. Whereas it sounds like maybe at Collide, you guys have been figuring out things that maybe the rest of us don't know.
It's sort of, I feel bad when I don't fix the things that I hear might be broken in osquery, and they might not even be. They might even just incorrect rumors. But one of the things we found is that turnaround time matters. If we discover that a plist path is wrong, just because of the reality of updating customer endpoints, even on an auto update cycle, there's still this incredibly long tail. Like we will just get a vastly faster turnaround by updating it server side. So we end up seeing stuff like that. And I don't know, Teddy's point is interesting, right? That osquery's job is to abstract this. My counterpoint is that I think of osquery as an API translation layer. To me, osquery's job is to make this kind of data accessible. And I would much rather have sort of nicely compostable, accessible things than to try and create well-formed interfaces to all the things, because I don't think it's possible. So I've kind of moved away from creating those towards, just can I expose this data in a technically correct way and then deal with something absolutely ridiculous server side because it gives me flexibility. And this might not be correct, right? These are like maybe slightly complementary viewpoints, but I wanted to raise it.
So what do you do when you have an abstract concept that exists as a plist on one system and a registry key on the other?
I mean, we have different queries for things like macOS and Windows because we can't blur those together. We have to abstract those. And, I don't have a simple answer. And the other thing is there's no simple translation between them, right? Because you might say something like, I don't know, let me make up I'll make up a wonderful one, right? Like screen lock enabled, everyone's favorite windmill to joust at with osquery, right? It is not at all a simple Boolean. You might say like, is my screen lock enabled? That's just a simple Boolean. Is in the registry, is it in the preferences? But as you dig into it, you discover that it's like 7 things that you have to combine in weirdly arbitrary ways. On OS X, you have, does the display go to sleep? Does the display go to screensaver? Does the screensaver lock? These are different for AC adapters versus battery. How much time passes at each of those checkpoints? So you have this huge wealth of information that you have to process to make a decision about whether or not screen lock is enabled. There's no, and the reality is you'll get it wrong too, at least like 2 or 3 times. And then you have to sort of bring in all of the levels of profile management on top of that. It's very hard to codify that to a simple table. I can't say the Windows side or the Linux side, right? For the Linux side, you're going to look at, that's going to be different for every possible Linux variant, right? Like GNOME is all going to be somewhere in G settings. That's cool. But like, I don't know where KDE stashes that. I also don't know where Windows puts it, but I think it's probably in the registry somewhere or a WMI query. So I run into these things where like, it's very hard to actually present a simple answer. So I've taken the path of creating enough rope that we can do complicated things.
But hey, so it sounds like there's a bunch of different audiences for osquery, and I think we're doing a good job at like giving the osquery engineers out there that are going to sort of layer services on top of this the right tools. Like we give you the raw registry, we give you the raw plist. So it sounds like we're doing a good job there. For everyone else, like I think we can do a good best effort at abstracting some of these concepts into tables. Maybe some of those concepts can be abstracted into queries that we push into query packs, like a pretty unused feature that we have committed. So let's just be mindful that there's multiple audiences out there. Let's like not kind of pigeonhole ourselves into only one approach for these audiences.
That's why I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're at Collide.
Oh no, go ahead, Mike.
So at Collide, you're more agile with updating your queries than osquery is at releasing. So if you segment code and queries into different repos, maybe one of those repos could be as agile as Collide is with their fleet product, and therefore still provide the current location for things. Or maybe the tests, could be better, and when they break, we could do point releases that implement only things like correctness fixes, so that we don't wait 2 months between things like that.
The biggest reason we don't do point releases is just in terms of managing it in the Git flow. We would probably just cut a release early if we wanted. If it was pressing enough, we would just cut it early. But the thing that's harder for us to get around is not the release cycle, it's the long tail of client updates. We have many people who run osquery. It takes a long time to get them all updated.
Yeah, realistically it does. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
People here are dropping out because we have another meeting. Do you think we have a resolution on this discussion, or we're going to create a guideline?
There was no resolution needed.
So we would like to have a guideline about it. Maybe the guideline could be a blueprint issue.
Maybe.
What do you think?
And it sounds like we need to make a decision on these PRs that are active right now. So maybe we can do that in core or something like that.
We can do that in PR. It sounds like there's enough interest in them that like I don't think we need to block them. But I took them as a I wanted to talk about it. I didn't want to be like, no, these are no good. I wanted to see what people thought, because I feel like this is to put it bluntly, I think we have too many tables. Like we have these mostly overlapping things that confuse me, and I would rather have fewer things that were more compostable than more things that I couldn't put together. But this is, I think Teddy's point about we have different audiences, and having a whole set of maybe all you care about is the simple query. We baked it for you, and like go nuts, thread hunter, right? So it's I don't know what right is. I wanted to have us all talking about it.
Okay, well, if we didn't do enough talking, maybe we could do more in a blueprint issue. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. There's definitely no consensus right now, so it seems like moving forward with these PRs and talking about it is good.
Agreed. I'll comment in the PRs that we talked about it a little bit, and certainly I'm not obviously in the majority. So
yeah, I'm gonna head out, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, I got to go too. Thanks, everybody.
Do you want to hit me up if we can't figure out what you need in the Yara PR?
Yeah, after another sequence of.
I'm around most of the day.
Okay, later today then.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.